We think we know the story. We see the monuments of white marble and the ink on yellowing parchment, and we think of history as something static, something finished. But the United States of America was never supposed to happen. It was a chaotic, bloody, and beautiful accident, a collision of 3 continents, 5 empires, and 1,000 different dreams. It is a story of a people who constantly tried to reinvent the world, often while failing to live up to their own ideals. Welcome to Once Upon Earth. Today, we are not just looking at a country. We are looking at an epic. We are going to walk through 4 centuries of fire, gold, and grit, from the first footprint on a Virginia shore to the digital glow of the 21st century. This is the entire story of the United States of America. To understand America, you have to realize that it wasn't a new world. By the time the first European ships appeared on the horizon, the Americas had been home to millions for over 15,000 years. In the Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans built cities into the sides of cliffs, architectural marvels that housed hundreds of families in stone apartments. Along the Mississippi River, the city of Cahokia rose as a metropolis of earthen pyramids, larger than London was at the same time in history. These were civilizations of trade, astronomy, and complex law. When Christopher Columbus arrived in the Caribbean in 1492, he didn't discover a wilderness. He stumbled into an interconnected web of nations. The Spanish conquistadors moved north first, driven by the 3 Gs: gold, God, and glory. They brought horses, steel, and Catholicism, but they also brought invisible killers. Smallpox and measles decimated up to 90% of the indigenous population before a single English settler ever set foot on the coast. The wilderness the Pilgrims found was actually a widowed land, a place where civilization had recently been shattered by plague. The English were late to the game. When the Virginia Company sent 3 ships to Jamestown in 1607, they weren't looking to build a democracy. They were looking for gold. They found none. Instead, they found a swamp filled with malaria and a powerful indigenous empire led by Powhatan. The starving time nearly wiped them out. Men were reduced to eating leather and, in some cases, each other. What saved Virginia was a leaf: tobacco. It was the first cash crop, and it changed everything. It required 2 things: land and labor. The hunger for land pushed the settlers into constant conflict with native tribes, and the hunger for labor led to a fateful day in 1619, when a Dutch ship arrived with 20 and odd captive Africans. This was the moment the American trajectory split, offering incredible wealth to some and hereditary bondage to others. Further north, in 1620, the story was different. The Pilgrims and Puritans weren't searching for riches. They were searching for a place to be left alone in their religious fervor. They signed the Mayflower Compact, one of the first ripples of self-government in the colonies. By the mid-18th century, 13 distinct colonies had formed. They were a strange mix: the Quaker peace of Pennsylvania, the rugged frontiers of Georgia, and the intellectual hubs of Massachusetts. They were British subjects, but they were starting to breathe a different air. They were becoming something else. The road to revolution didn't start with a tax on tea. It started with a world war. The 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War, was a brutal struggle for the Ohio River Valley. A young British officer named George Washington fired the first shots. Britain won, but the victory came with a staggering debt. King George III looked at his American subjects and decided it was time they paid their share. But the colonists had spent a century governing themselves. When Parliament passed the Stamp Act and the Townshend Acts, it wasn't the cost that hurt, it was the principle. They felt like second-class Englishmen. The tension boiled over on a snowy night in March 1770, when 5 colonists were killed by British redcoats in what became known as the Boston Massacre. Then came the Boston Tea Party, where millions of dollars worth of tea was dumped into the harbor in an act of theatrical defiance. Britain responded by closing the port and sending in the military. The intolerable acts did the one thing the king feared most. They united the colonies. In 1774, the First Continental Congress met. They weren't talking about independence yet. They just wanted their rights. But blood has a way of changing the conversation. On April 19, 1775, a shot rang out at North Bridge in Concord. No one knows who fired it, but the world heard it. The American Revolution had begun. It was a David versus Goliath struggle. Britain had the world's most powerful navy and a professional army of veterans. The Americans were farmers, blacksmiths, and tailors. In July 1776, they made it official. Thomas Jefferson, only 33 years old, drafted the Declaration of Independence. It was a suicide note if they lost, and a blueprint for a new world if they won. The war was a grueling 8-year slog, from the frozen misery of Valley Forge to the desperate crossing of the Delaware River. George Washington's greatest skill wasn't strategy, it was endurance. He knew he didn't have to defeat the British outright. He just had to keep his army alive until Britain lost the will to fight. With the help of French gold and warships, the Americans trapped the British at Yorktown in 1781. When General Cornwallis surrendered, his band played "The World Turned Upside Down." They were right. For the first time in history, a colony had successfully rebelled against its empire to form a republic. Winning the war was the easy part. Building a country was the nightmare. The first government, under the Articles of Confederation, was a failure. It couldn't tax, regulate commerce, or even print a stable currency. In 1787, the founders gathered in Philadelphia and started over. The Constitution they produced was brilliant and deeply flawed. It balanced power between 3 branches, but to secure Southern support, it made a devil's bargain, protecting slavery and counting enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for representation. As the 19th century began, America turned west. In 1803, Thomas Jefferson bought the Louisiana Territory from Napoleon for $15 million, doubling the nation's size overnight. Lewis and Clark crossed the continent and returned with stories of endless land. This ignited manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were divinely destined to rule the continent. It fueled the Oregon Trail and the California Gold Rush, but it also led to ethnic cleansing. The Trail of Tears forced thousands of Cherokee from their lands at gunpoint. America was growing fast, but it was tearing itself in two. The North was industrializing. The South was becoming a cotton empire dependent on the labor of 4 million enslaved people. By 1860, compromise had collapsed. The election of Abraham Lincoln, who opposed the expansion of slavery, pushed Southern states to secede. They formed the Confederacy, and war followed. The Civil War remains the bloodiest conflict in American history. At Antietam, more Americans died in a single day than in all previous wars combined. What began as a war to preserve the Union became a war for freedom after Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. Gettysburg marked the turning point. Appomattox marked the end. Slavery was abolished, but at the cost of 620,000 lives and a president assassinated days after victory. The United States became truly united but scarred. After the war, America surged into the Industrial Revolution. Railroads stitched the continent together. Titans of industry, Rockefeller, Carnegie, Morgan, amassed fortunes unlike anything the world had seen. Cities swelled with immigrants from Europe. It was the Gilded Age, dazzling on the surface, brutal underneath. As the 20th century arrived, America stepped onto the world stage. In 1917, it entered World War I and helped break the deadlock in Europe. The 1920s roared with jazz, consumerism, and speculation, until the stock market crashed in 1929. The Great Depression followed. 1 in 4 Americans was unemployed. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal rebuilt hope, but global war rebuilt the economy. After Pearl Harbor, the United States became an arsenal of democracy. 16 million Americans served in World War II. From Normandy to the Pacific, the nation fought fascism across the globe. The war ended with atomic fire over Japan, and the world entered the nuclear age. America emerged as a superpower. The Cold War defined the next half-century, a silent standoff with the Soviet Union. At home, prosperity grew, but so did resistance. The civil rights movement challenged segregation and injustice. The nation reached the moon, then tore itself apart over Vietnam. The late 20th century brought computers, the internet, and globalization. The fall of the Berlin Wall seemed to promise a new era. But the 21st century delivered fresh trials: terrorism, financial collapse, endless wars, and deep political division. Today, the United States is a nation of over 300 million people still wrestling with the same questions it asked at its birth. Who belongs? What does freedom mean? Can a republic built on contradiction endure? The American story is not a straight march toward progress. It is a cycle of struggle, a constant tension between ideals and reality. And as long as people continue to reach for that distant city on a hill, the American experiment remains unfinished, still the most ambitious and influential gamble in human history.